Welcome to the channel Final Slaves. Today's journey takes us back to 1859, into the life of Thomas Wiggins, a black boy living under exploitation who could sit at a piano and play with the brilliance of Mozart, yet never spoke a single word. People called it a miracle. But behind the applause lay a darker truth no one wished to face. This story is difficult and intense. So, take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe and tell me in the comments which city or country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are real, not buried. Let's begin. In the summer of 1858, inside a packed concert hall in Columbus, Georgia, something occurred that none in attendance could explain. Over 800 people had gathered that night. Wealthy plantation owners filled the front rows, their wives dressed in silk and satin. Local politicians whispered among themselves. Newspaper reporters clutched their notebooks, waiting for something worth writing about. They had all paid good money to see what the advertisements called the greatest musical curiosity in the American South. Yet none were prepared for what they would witness. The stage was simple, just a grand piano polished to a mirror shine, sitting alone under the gaslight. The audience grew quiet when a white man in a tailored suit walked out and raised his hand. His name was James Neal Bethune, a lawyer and former newspaper editor who had made his fortune in land and slaves. He smiled at the crowd like a circus ringmaster about to reveal the main attraction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you are about to see will challenge everything you believe about the Negro race. What you are about to hear will make you question the very nature of God's creation. I present to you a boy who cannot read a single word. A boy who cannot write his own name. A boy doctors have declared mentally deficient, barely capable of feeding or dressing himself. And yet, this same boy will sit at this piano and perform feats of musical genius that the greatest composers in Europe could not match." The audience murmured. Some laughed nervously. Others leaned forward. Bethune paused for effect, then gestured toward the side of the stage. "I give you Blind Tom." A small figure emerged from the shadows. He was 8 years old, though he looked younger. His skin was dark, almost blue-black in the gaslight. His eyes were closed, covered by thick, milky cataracts that had blinded him since birth. He walked with an odd, shuffling gait, his head bobbing slightly, his hands flapping at his sides in a strange rhythmic pattern. The audience gasped. Some women covered their mouths. A few men shook their heads in pity or disgust. This was not what they expected. This was not a performer. This was a broken child, clearly damaged, obviously simple-minded. Several people began to stand, ready to demand their money back. But then the boy reached the piano. He did not need guidance to the bench. He found it himself, his small fingers brushing the wood until he located the keys. He sat down, adjusted his position, and placed his hands on the keyboard. The room fell silent. And then, Thomas Wiggins began to play. The music that poured from that piano was unlike anything those 800 people had ever heard. It was Beethoven's Sonata Pathetique, one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, a composition professional musicians spend years mastering. The blind child played it flawlessly. His fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was exactly as Beethoven intended. The dynamics rose and fell like ocean waves, soft as a whisper one moment, thunderous as a storm the next. When he finished, there was no applause. The audience sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Bethune smiled. He had seen this reaction before. "If any gentleman or lady would like to test young Tom's abilities," he announced, "please come forward. Play any piece you wish, no matter how complex or obscure. Tom will listen once and reproduce it." "Exactly." A man in the third row stood. He was a music teacher from Milledgeville, a classically trained pianist who had studied in Philadelphia. He walked to the stage with a skeptical expression, sat at a second piano, and began a complicated etude by Chopin, filled with rapid scales and intricate finger work. Tom sat motionless, his blind eyes staring at nothing, his head tilted as if listening to something far away. The music teacher finished. He turned to Tom with a smirk, confident this trick would end here. Tom placed his hands on his piano and played the etude back. Perfectly. The audience erupted. Over the next hour, person after person came to the stage to test the boy. A church organist played a hymn he had composed himself, a piece no one else had ever heard. Tom reproduced it perfectly. A woman played a simple melody with her right hand while playing a completely different melody with her left. Tom played both simultaneously, then added a third melody of his own invention with his feet on the pedals. A German immigrant played a folk song from his homeland, singing the lyrics in German as he accompanied himself. Tom played the song back and hummed the melody in perfect pitch, even mimicking the man's accent. By the end of the night, grown men were weeping. Women had fainted. The music teacher sat with his head in his hands, muttering that he had wasted his entire life. And James Bethune stood at the side of the stage, counting the money in his head. That night in Columbus was not Tom's first performance, nor would it be his last. Over the next 5 decades, the blind boy from Georgia would become the most famous musician in America. He would play for presidents and generals. He would fill concert halls across the country and tour Europe to standing ovations. He would earn the equivalent of over $20 million in today's money. But Thomas Wiggins would never see a cent of it. He would never choose where to live, what to eat, or when to sleep. He would never have a friend, a wife, or a family of his own. He would remain, in every way that mattered, a slave, even after slavery ended. Even after the law said he was free. Even until the day he died. This is the true story of Blind Tom, the greatest musical genius America ever produced. And this is the story of how America destroyed him. Thomas Green Wiggins was born on May 25, 1849, on a plantation in Harris County, Georgia, near Columbus. His mother was a woman named Charity, sometimes recorded as Charity Green, who was owned by a man named Wiley Jones. Charity had already given birth to at least a dozen children, all sold away from her over the years. Tom was her 13th child, and from birth, it was clear something was different. The baby emerged with his eyes covered by thick white cataracts. He was completely blind. But that was not all. In the weeks after his birth, Charity noticed her son did not behave like her other children. He did not respond to his name. He did not look at her face. He did not cry when hungry. He simply lay there, silent and still, as if elsewhere entirely. The other enslaved people whispered the child was cursed. Some said he had no soul. Others said he was God's punishment. Even Charity, who loved her son, sometimes wondered if anything was inside that small, silent body at all. In the fall of 1850, when Tom was about 18 months old, Wiley Jones decided to sell some of his slaves to pay debts. He brought his healthiest workers to the auction block in Columbus. Among the buyers was James Neal Bethune, a 46-year-old lawyer and newspaperman who had recently purchased a large plantation called Solitude. Bethune was looking for field hands, but his attention was drawn to a woman at the edge of the group, clutching a small child. The woman was Charity. The child was Tom. Bethune examined them with a businessman's cold eye. Charity was healthy and strong. But the child was defective, blind, unresponsive, probably simple-minded. No one would pay for a slave who could never work. Wiley Jones knew this, selling them together as a package to unload the damaged goods. He offered them at a steep discount, just $400 for the pair. Bethune hesitated. He did not want to feed a useless child. But Charity was a good worker, and the price was too low to pass up. He made the deal. And so, Thomas Wiggins became the property of James Neal Bethune. Neither knew this transaction would change both their lives forever. The first years at Solitude were hard. Charity worked long hours in the fields while Tom stayed in the slave quarters, cared for by older women. As he grew, it became clear Tom was unlike any child anyone had seen. He still did not speak. He showed no interest in playing with others. He spent hours alone, rocking back and forth, humming strange melodies, running his fingers along surfaces. He seemed obsessed with sound. He would press his ear against the ground to hear vibrations. He would tap walls, listening to echoes. He would sit outside during thunderstorms, his face turned skyward, drinking in the crash and rumble as if it were music. The other enslaved people did not know what to make of him. Some thought he was touched by spirits. Others thought he was simply an idiot. The Bethune family ignored him entirely. He was just another slave child, and a broken one at that. But everything changed one night in the summer of 1855, when Tom was 6. The Bethune family had gathered in the parlor for an evening of music. James Bethune's daughters were taking piano lessons, and their teacher had come to hear them practice. One by one, the girls played simple exercises, their fingers stumbling over the keys. No one noticed the small figure crouched outside the window, hidden in darkness. Tom had followed the music from the slave quarters. He had never heard a piano before, and the sound fascinated him. He pressed his face against the glass, his blind eyes staring at nothing, his entire body vibrating with the notes. When the lesson ended and the family went to bed, Tom did something impossible. He found his way to the back door, left unlocked. He navigated through unfamiliar rooms by listening to echoes. He found the parlor. He found the piano. And he began to play. The sound woke the household. James Bethune grabbed his pistol, certain an intruder had broken in. His wife and daughters huddled in terror. The overseer came running with a lantern. When they burst into the parlor, they found little Tom at the piano bench, his blind eyes closed, his small fingers moving across the keys with supernatural grace. He was playing one of the pieces Bethune's daughter had practiced earlier. He was playing it perfectly. Bethune stood frozen, his pistol limp at his side. He watched the blind, mute, supposedly idiotic slave child perform music his own daughters could barely manage after months of lessons. And in that moment, James Neil Bethune realized he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Over the following weeks, Bethune conducted what he called experiments on Tom. He brought in local musicians to test the boy's abilities. He had them play increasingly complex pieces, watching in amazement as Tom absorbed each after a single hearing and reproduced it without error. He discovered Tom could play with his hands crossed, with his back to the piano, even with a cloth draped over the keyboard so he could not feel the keys. The music seemed to flow through him from some unknown source. But there was more. Tom did not just reproduce music. He created it. He would sit at the piano for hours, improvising melodies no one had ever heard, compositions ranging from simple and sweet to dark and complex. The music poured out of him like water from a spring, endless and effortless and utterly original. Bethune was not a musical man. He could not read sheet music or play an instrument. But he recognized something that mattered far more in the antebellum South, an opportunity to make money. In 1857, when Tom was 8, Bethune organized the first public exhibition of the boy's talents. He rented a concert hall in Columbus and plastered the town with advertisements. He promoted Tom not as an artist, but as a curiosity, a freak of nature, a marvel to be witnessed like a two-headed calf at a circus. The show was a sensation. The hall sold out. People came from miles around to see the blind Negro boy who could play piano like a European master. Bethune charged 50 cents admission, a significant sum, and still turned people away. By the end of the night, he had made more money than his plantation earned in a month. Bethune immediately began planning a tour. He pulled Tom from his mother in the only home he had ever known. He loaded the boy into a carriage and set off across Georgia, then South Carolina, then the rest of the South. The format was always the same. Bethune would give his speech about the idiot savant, the mental defective who could somehow channel musical genius. Then Tom would play. Then the audience challenges would begin. Every night, local musicians came forward, certain they could stump him. Every night, Tom proved them wrong. The money rolled in. Bethune invested it in more advertising, more tours, bigger venues. By 1858, Blind Tom was the most talked about act in the American South. Newspapers ran breathless reviews. Scientists and doctors published papers trying to explain his abilities. Religious leaders debated whether his talent was a gift from God or a curse from the devil. And through it all, Tom remained a slave. He slept in back rooms and basements. He ate scraps. He had no say in where he went, what he played, or how long he performed. Bethune owned him completely, body and soul. The question of how Tom developed his extraordinary abilities has puzzled researchers for over a century and a half. Modern experts believe he was almost certainly autistic, exhibiting what would today be classified as savant syndrome, a rare condition where individuals with developmental disabilities display exceptional abilities in specific areas like music or memory. Tom showed classic signs of autism: difficulty with social interaction and communication, repetitive behaviors like rocking and hand flapping, intense focus on specific interests, sound and music, sensory sensitivities, and what appeared to be perfect pitch and an eidetic memory for music. In the 19th century, none of this was understood. The term autism would not be coined until 1908, the year Tom died. In his time, he was simply classified as an idiot, a person of such low intelligence he was considered barely human. This classification was convenient for those who profited from him. If Tom was not really a person, not really conscious, then there was nothing wrong with using him like a trained animal. But evidence suggests Tom was far more aware than anyone gave him credit for. He responded to kindness and cruelty, showing distress when treated harshly and pleasure when treated well. He formed attachments. He had preferences and desires, even if he could not express them in words. Most importantly, he had opinions about his own music. Bethune discovered early that Tom could not be forced to play. If tired, hungry, or upset, he would sit at the piano in silence, no matter the threats. If he did not like a piece, he would refuse to learn it or play it mockingly. If in the mood to compose, he would ignore all requests and play only his own creations for hours. This was not the behavior of a mindless automaton. This was the behavior of an artist. By 1860, Blind Tom was the most famous musical performer in the American South. He had played for governors and senators. He had performed in the finest halls from New Orleans to Richmond. He had been written about in newspapers across the country and in Europe. He was, by any measure, a star. He was also still a slave. The question of Tom's legal status was complicated. James Bethune had purchased him as property. But Tom was also a human being, and his abilities raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of intelligence and the justification for slavery. Southern apologists had long argued Africans were mentally inferior, incapable of higher thought, suited only for manual labor. Blind Tom demolished this argument simply by existing. Here was a Negro, a slave, classified as property, who could outperform any white musician in the South. Here was proof that black minds were not inferior, that African blood did not preclude genius, that the intellectual foundation of slavery was a lie. Bethune was aware of this contradiction and worked hard to explain it away. In advertisements and speeches, he emphasized Tom's supposed mental deficiency, his inability to care for himself, his animal-like nature. Tom was not really intelligent, Bethune insisted. He was merely a vessel, a freak of nature. His musical ability was not evidence of a sophisticated mind, but a parlor trick, like a dog that could count. This explanation satisfied most white audiences. It allowed them to enjoy Tom's performances without questioning their beliefs about race. But not everyone was convinced. Northern abolitionists seized on Blind Tom as evidence of slavery's injustice. How could anyone claim Negroes were mentally inferior when a blind slave child could outperform the best white musicians? How could anyone justify owning a human being with such obvious genius? The debate intensified as the 1860 presidential election approached and the country lurched toward civil war. For Bethune, the timing was dangerous. If the Union won and slavery ended, he would lose his most valuable asset. Tom was worth more than the entire plantation, more than all his other slaves combined. Losing him would mean financial ruin. So Bethune took steps to protect his investment. In 1859, he drew up a legal contract with Tom's parents, Charity, and her husband Mingo. The contract stated the Wiggins family agreed to let Bethune keep Tom and manage his career in exchange for a small annual payment and a promise Tom would be well cared for. The contract was a sham. Charity and Mingo could not legally enter contracts because they were slaves. They could not negotiate terms. They could not refuse because refusal meant punishment or sale. The document was designed to give Bethune a paper trail if Tom's ownership was ever challenged. That challenge was coming sooner than anyone expected. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. James Bethune, a loyal Confederate, sent his sons to fight. He donated money and supplies to the Southern Army. And he continued to tour with Blind Tom, staging concerts across the Confederacy to raise funds and boost morale. Tom became, in effect, a propaganda tool for the Southern cause. Bethune presented him as proof of slavery's benevolence, evidence that enslaved people were well cared for and allowed to develop talents under their master's guidance. Confederate newspapers praised Tom's performances as symbols of Southern culture. Confederate generals attended his concerts. What Tom thought about all this, no one knows. He could not speak, write, or express his opinions in any way white people would recognize. He simply played the music they asked, performed the tricks they demanded, and kept whatever thoughts he had locked inside his silent mind. But perhaps the music itself was a form of expression. During the war years, Tom began composing pieces with titles like The Battle of Manassas and March to the Battlefield, ostensibly celebrating Confederate victories. These compositions were popular with Southern audiences, who heard in them the glory of their cause. But musicologists studying these pieces in recent decades have found something strange. Hidden within the triumphal melodies are darker elements, dissonant chords that sound like screams, rhythms echoing the crack of whips, minor key passages evoking sorrow and mourning. Some researchers believe Tom was encoding his true feelings about the war and slavery into music his white audiences could not fully understand. If true, then Blind Tom was not just a passive victim. He was a secret rebel, expressing resistance in the only language available to him, hiding defiance in plain sight while white Confederates applauded. The war ended in April 1865 with Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. A month later, the 13th Amendment was ratified, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. 4 million enslaved people were suddenly free, including Tom's mother Charity, his father Mingo, and every other black person in the South. Tom should have been free, too. He was 16, a young man who had spent his life performing for white audiences and earning money for white owners. He had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars, more than most free people earned in a lifetime. He deserved freedom and the chance to control his own life and career. But James Bethune had other plans. Months after the war's end, Bethune went to court and filed for legal guardianship of Tom. He argued Tom was mentally incompetent, unable to care for himself, in need of a responsible white person to manage his affairs. He produced doctors who testified Tom was an idiot, a creature with the mind of a young child, incapable of decisions or handling money. He pointed to Tom's strange behaviors, his inability to speak, his apparent confusion. The court agreed. In 1865, the same year slavery ended, Thomas Wiggins was declared a legal ward of James Neal Bethune. Tom was free in name only. In practice, nothing had changed. Bethune still controlled where he lived, what he did, and where his money went. The chains had been replaced by paperwork. Blind Tom's slavery continued, hidden behind the legal fiction of guardianship, invisible to a nation trying to convince itself the sin of slavery had been washed away. This was not unusual. Across the South, white people found new ways to control black labor without calling it slavery. Black codes restricted where freed people could live and work. Vagrancy laws allowed police to arrest black people for being unemployed and force them to work without pay. Sharecropping trapped families in cycles of debt. But Tom's situation was unique. He was not a field hand. He was the most famous musician in America, a performer who had played for presidents, a genius whose abilities defied explanation. And he was still, in every way that mattered, a slave. The concert tours continued. Bethune took Tom north for the first time, staging shows in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Northern audiences packed the halls. Abolitionists protested outside some venues, demanding Tom's freedom. But the shows went on, and money kept flowing into Bethune's pockets. In 1866, Tom performed at the White House for President Andrew Johnson. It was a prestigious engagement, a command performance. Johnson was reportedly impressed, though what Tom thought about playing for a man undermining Reconstruction remains unknown. By the end of the 1860s, Blind Tom had earned the equivalent of several $1 million today. He had performed hundreds of concerts across the United States and begun planning European tours. Financially, he was one of the most successful entertainers of his era. And he still owned nothing, not a house, not a dollar, not even the clothes on his back. Everything he earned belonged to James Bethune. Everything he would ever earn would belong to James Bethune or his heirs. The guardianship ensured Tom would remain a source of wealth for white people until he died. Tom's mother, Charity, watched from a distance. After emancipation, she stayed in Georgia, working as a domestic servant. She had no money, no education, no resources to fight for her son in court. She could only watch as her child was paraded across the country, seen as a curiosity rather than a person. In 1870, Charity attempted to challenge Bethune's guardianship. She hired a lawyer, scraping together money, and filed suit demanding custody. The case dragged on for years, mired in delays. Bethune hired expensive attorneys who argued Charity was unfit, lacked resources, and that removing Tom would destroy his livelihood. The court sided with Bethune. Charity lost her case and her son. She died a few years later, never having held Tom again, never having spoken to him without white people listening, never having seen him as anything but a performer on a stage. And Tom played on, night after night, year after year, a prisoner in the only world he had ever known. In the spring of 1882, a New York Times reporter traveled to Warrenton, Virginia, to interview the most famous musician in America. The reporter had heard the stories: the blind Negro boy who could play any piece after hearing it once, the idiot savant who performed for presidents, the human curiosity who earned millions without understanding money. He was not prepared for what he found. Thomas Wiggins was 32, no longer a boy but a man. He sat in a small, dark room in a boarding house, rocking slowly in a wooden chair. His eyes were still clouded with cataracts. His hair was graying. His clothes were simple and worn, nothing like the fine suits he wore on stage. When the reporter entered, Tom did not acknowledge him. He kept rocking, humming a melody, his fingers tapping against his thighs as if playing an invisible piano. The reporter introduced himself, said he wanted to write about Tom's life. Tom said nothing. The reporter asked about Tom's childhood, his music, his travels. Still nothing. Tom seemed in his own world, where reporters and questions did not matter. Finally, the reporter asked if Tom would play the piano in the corner. For the first time, Tom stopped rocking. His head tilted as if considering. Then he stood, walked to the piano without assistance, sat down, and placed his hands on the keys. What followed was unlike anything the reporter had ever heard. Tom played for nearly 2 hours without stopping. He moved through Beethoven and Mozart, through Bach and Chopin, through folk songs and hymns and popular melodies. He played his own compositions, strange and beautiful pieces seeming to come from another dimension. He played with his eyes closed, with his back to the piano, with his hands crossed, with a handkerchief draped over the keys. When he finally stopped, the reporter sat in stunned silence. Tears ran down his face. Tom returned to his rocking chair and resumed humming as if nothing had happened. The reporter filed his story the next day. He described blind Tom as the greatest musical genius he had ever encountered, a man whose abilities defied scientific explanation. But he also described a prisoner, a man trapped in a life he had not chosen, controlled by people who saw him only as a source of income. A genius robbed of everything except his music. The story caused a minor sensation, but nothing changed. Tom kept performing. His handlers kept collecting money. The world kept treating him as a curiosity. The 1870s and 1880s were the peak of blind Tom's fame and earning power. He performed constantly, sometimes 2 or 3 concerts a day, traveling by train in an endless circuit. He played in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, New Orleans, London, Paris, Berlin. He performed for Queen Victoria, who reportedly wept openly. He performed for Emperor Wilhelm I, who declared him the most remarkable musician in the world. But success did not bring freedom. James Bethune maintained iron control. He decided where Tom performed, how long concerts lasted, what pieces were played. He negotiated contracts, collected fees, and deposited money in his accounts. Tom received nothing but food, clothing, and a place to sleep. Accommodations varied. In some cities, Tom stayed in fine hotels, though in back rooms or servants' quarters. Elsewhere, he slept in boarding houses or local black families' homes. He rarely stayed anywhere more than a few nights. The schedule was relentless, designed for maximum profit. Tom's health suffered. He was frequently exhausted, sometimes performing while visibly ill. He had episodes of confusion and agitation, behaviors today recognized as autistic burnout or sensory overload. When these occurred, Bethune canceled shows, not out of concern for Tom, but because a sick performer could not generate revenue. There were other costs. Tom had no friends, no romantic relationships, no connection to the black community that might have embraced him. He existed in a strange limbo, too famous to be anonymous, too controlled to be free. He was surrounded constantly, but utterly alone. Few accounts of Tom's inner life exist. A stagehand in Philadelphia reported Tom sometimes cried at night, sobbing quietly for hours. A hotel maid in Boston said Tom once grabbed her hand and held it, not threateningly, but desperately, as if needing human contact. A music critic in London wrote Tom seemed to brighten when children were present, playing silly songs to make them laugh, the only times he appeared genuinely happy. But these glimpses were rare. For most of his life, Tom remained a mystery, locked inside his mind, communicating only through music. In 1875, James Bethune transferred legal guardianship to his son, John Bethune. The elder Bethune was aging and wanted to ensure the family continued profiting from Tom after his death. The transfer was accomplished through courts, with Tom having no say. He was passed from one owner to another like furniture. John Bethune was a different master. Where James was cold and calculating, John was volatile and cruel. He drank heavily and had a violent temper. He saw Tom not as a valuable asset, but as a personal possession to be used as he wished. Under John, Tom's life hardened. The touring schedule intensified. Accommodations worsened. John frequently berated Tom in public, mocking his disabilities, threatening punishment if he did not perform. There are reports John sometimes struck Tom, though details are unclear. Tom's behavior changed. He became more withdrawn, more prone to distress, more resistant to performing. But he had no escape. He could not see. He could not navigate alone. He had no money, no connections, no understanding of how to survive. He was as trapped as any slave, though slavery had ended a decade earlier. 1882 brought a new complication. John Bethune's wife, Eliza, filed for divorce, citing his drinking, violence, and infidelity. The proceedings were bitter in public. At the center was blind Tom. Eliza argued she should receive custody as part of the settlement, claiming she had been more involved in managing Tom's career, treated him better, and was better equipped to care for him. John countered Tom was his property, inherited from his father. The case dragged on for years. Tom was never consulted. His preferences never considered. He was a prize to be won, a source of income to be fought over. In 1887, courts ruled in Eliza's favor. She was awarded custody of Tom and a portion of his future earnings. John was ordered to turn Tom over and cease involvement. Tom was 38. He had been performing professionally for over 30 years. He had earned millions. And he had just been transferred from one white owner to another, his fate determined by lawyers and judges who never asked what he wanted. Eliza Bethune proved a somewhat better guardian, if only because she was less cruel. She reduced Tom's touring slightly and improved his living conditions. She allowed more rest and ensured adequate food and clothing. But she was still motivated by profit. She still saw Tom as a commodity. Under Eliza, Tom performed through the late 1880s and into the 1890s. He was older, and his fame had faded. The novelty wore off. Younger performers captured public attention. Newspapers barely mentioned him. But Tom could still draw crowds in smaller towns. Eliza focused on these markets, booking him into smaller venues for lower fees. Tours were less glamorous but still profitable. During this period, Tom showed signs of decline. His memory, once infinite, began to falter. He would forget pieces played hundreds of times. He would lose his place and have to start over. His improvisations became less fluid, less inspired. The genius flickered. Tom also became more difficult. He would sometimes refuse to perform, sitting at the piano in silence despite pleas or threats. He would play pieces not on the program, ignoring audience requests. He would stop mid-concert and walk off stage without explanation. These incidents grew unpredictable and frequent. Some historians interpret this as resistance, Tom's only way to assert control. He could not speak, escape, or fight physically, but he could refuse. He could sit in silence. In a life of powerlessness, this small rebellion may have been his only agency. Others suggest it was aging and mental decline. He was approaching 50, ancient for the time, and his brain no longer functioned as before. His strange behaviors became more pronounced, disruptive, and difficult to manage. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. By the mid-1890s, blind Tom was no longer a reliable money-making machine. His performances were inconsistent, audiences shrank, earning power declined. Eliza, who had fought hard for control, wondered if he was worth the trouble. In 1898, something remarkable happened. A lawyer named Albion Tourget took interest in Tom's case. Tourget, a former Union soldier, had dedicated his life to civil rights. He was famous for arguing Plessy v. Ferguson before the Supreme Court, the landmark case that established separate but equal, though he lost. He remained committed to racial justice. Tourget believed Tom was held illegally, that guardianship violated his constitutional rights. He filed suit on Tom's behalf, arguing a competent adult could not be held as a ward without consent, that guardianship laws perpetuated a form of slavery, and that Tom deserved to control his own life and earnings. The case attracted attention. Newspapers covered proceedings. Editorials debated the merits. For a moment, it seemed Tom might finally be freed. But courts disagreed. Judge after judge ruled Tom was mentally incompetent, required a guardian, and the arrangement with Eliza was legal. Evidence of Tom's disabilities was overwhelming, they said. He could not speak, care for himself, understand money or contracts. Without a guardian, he would be helpless. Tourget appealed. Higher courts affirmed the rulings. The case was closed. Tom remained Eliza's property in all but name. Tourget died in 1905, still fighting for his causes. Tom outlived him by 3 years. Tom's final decade was marked by obscurity and decline. Eliza had largely given up touring by 1900. Travel costs no longer justified dwindling audiences. Tom was kept in a small house in Hoboken, New Jersey, cared for by hired servants, trotted out occasionally for private performances when Eliza needed money. Few visitors came. Newspapers had moved on. The musical world had evolved. Blind Tom, once America's most famous performer, was largely forgotten. But Tom still had his music. He still played every day, for hours, alone in his small room with a battered upright piano. He played pieces learned decades earlier, Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, that once brought audiences to their feet. He played his own compositions, strange and beautiful melodies from his unique mind. He played for no one but himself. What did Tom think during those lonely hours? What memories? What emotions? We will never know. He could not tell us. He could only play. In 1904, Eliza was interviewed for a retrospective article. She described Tom as a simple creature, content, grateful for her care, like a child, innocent and happy, unaware of the world's complexities. Others who saw Tom painted a different picture. A servant in the Hoboken house said Tom often seemed sad, sitting for hours in silence, refusing to eat or engage. A neighbor reported hearing Tom play the same mournful melody over and over late at night, sound drifting through walls like a ghost. A doctor who examined Tom in 1906 noted signs of depression and withdrawal, common in prolonged isolation. The truth is somewhere between. Tom was neither contented innocent nor tragic figure. He was a complex human with thoughts, feelings, and experiences we can only guess at. He lived an extraordinary life, triumph and tragedy, fame and exploitation, genius and suffering. And now that life was ending. On June 13, 1908, Thomas Green Wiggins died of a stroke at 59. He was alone in his small room in Hoboken, far from concert halls and the plantation of his birth. His death was briefly reported in a few newspapers, mostly as a curiosity. Headlines called him Blind Tom, the name reducing his existence to a disability and nickname. Few mentioned his full name. Few acknowledged his humanity. Few mourned. Eliza arranged a modest funeral. Tom was buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, in an unmarked grave. The men who performed for presidents and queens, played in finest halls on 2 continents, earned millions, was laid to rest without a stone to mark his place. For nearly a century, no one knew where Thomas Wiggins was buried. His grave was lost, forgotten like the men. Not until 1976 did researchers locate his remains in a plot purchased by Eliza under her own name. In 2002, a proper marker was placed. It reads, Thomas Wiggins Bethune, Blind Tom, 1849 to 1908, renowned pianist and composer. The marker acknowledges both his slave name and stage name, identities imposed by white owners who saw him as prophet. But it also calls him what he truly was, a pianist, a composer, an artist. It took 94 years for America to put those words on his grave, 94 years to acknowledge Thomas Wiggins was more than a curiosity, more than a freak, more than property. He was a musician, one of the greatest who ever lived. The story of Blind Tom raises uncomfortable questions America has never fully answered. How do we reckon with the exploitation of black genius? How account for wealth extracted from enslaved people? How honor those robbed of freedom and identity? Tom earned over $20 million equivalent during his career. Every penny went to white people, first James Bethune, then John, then Eliza. The family that purchased Tom as defective property became wealthy beyond imagination from his talent. What did Tom receive? A room, food, clothes, bare necessities provided not from kindness, but to keep the money-making machine functioning. This was his reality. He was not a person but a product, not an artist but an attraction, not a human being but a human tool used for others' profit. Some defenders argue the Bethunes deserved compensation for managing Tom's career, that without them he would have remained an unknown slave. There is truth, Tom could not have managed tours, negotiated contracts, or handled finances alone. He needed help navigating a world he could not see. But this ignores the fundamental injustice. Tom did not choose managers. He did not consent to terms. He did not agree to give all earnings for food and shelter. Decisions were made without his input by people with a financial interest in keeping him dependent and controlled. A just arrangement would have been different. Tom could have been paid fairly, with earnings set aside for his care and future. He could have received education and support to develop independence. He could have been treated as a human with rights, not property to exploit. But that required white America to see Tom as a person. And white America was not ready, not in 1858, not in 1865, not in 1908. The myth of black inferiority was too powerful, convenient, embedded. So Tom lived and died a slave in everything but name. His story was mostly forgotten, a footnote in American music history, an uncomfortable reminder of truths Americans preferred not to face. But here is the remarkable thing about Thomas Wiggins. Despite exploitation, cruelty, and dehumanization, he left something his oppressors could never take, his music. Tom composed over 100 original pieces. Many are lost, never written down. But some survive, revealing a mind of extraordinary depth and complexity. His most famous composition is the Battle of Manassas, a musical depiction of a Confederate victory. On surface, it seems a celebration. But listen closely, you hear chaos, confusion, suffering, death, the true horror of war rendered in notes white audiences applauded without understanding. Another, The Rainstorm, captures a violent thunderstorm with uncanny accuracy. It begins with soft raindrops, builds to terrifying climax, subsides to calm. It is programmatic genius, painting pictures with sound few composers have matched. Most revealing are unnamed pieces, improvised melodies played late at night, alone. These were never performed publicly, never written, never intended for an audience. They were Tom's private language, his way of expressing thoughts and feelings he could not put into words. Witnesses described these performances in mystical terms, music from another world, unbearably sad or strangely joyful, beyond human comprehension. They felt they eavesdropped on something sacred, not meant for their ears. What was Tom saying? Mourning his lost mother. Raging against captivity. Dreaming of freedom. Expressing pure joy of creation, the one pleasure not taken from him. We will never know. But we know he played every day for 50 years. He played through slavery and war, poverty and exploitation, loneliness and despair. He played. Music was his refuge, rebellion, revenge. The one part of his life belonging entirely to him. And that music survived. The Bethunes are forgotten, remembered only through connection to Tom. Their money spent, power dissolved. But Tom's compositions are still performed today, studied by musicologists, marveled at by pianists, appreciated by audiences who never knew his name. In this sense, Tom won. Not the victory he deserved, not freedom, respect, or compensation, but a victory nonetheless. His genius outlasted his oppressors. His art transcended suffering. His music carries his story forward, speaking to generations who never knew him, testifying to what he was and what was done. There is a lesson, though not comfortable. The lesson is not that talent conquers all, genius is always recognized, or justice prevails. Tom's life proves the opposite: talent exploited, genius imprisoned, justice delayed forever. The lesson is simpler, more profound: human beings are more than what is done to them. More than categories imposed. More than names they are called or roles forced to play. Tom was called an idiot, but was a genius. Called property, but was a person. Called Blind Tom as if blindness and a nickname defined him. But he was Thomas Green Wiggins, a man with a mother who loved him, a mind that created beauty, a soul that endured. Those who exploited him wanted to reduce him to a commodity, a curiosity, a thing. They wanted to extract value without acknowledging his humanity. They wanted to profit from his gifts while denying any inner life worth respecting. They failed. Not materially, they took his money, controlled his body, owned his labor. In that sense, they won completely. But they failed to erase him. Failed to silence him. Failed to make him nothing. Because Tom spoke, not in words, but in music. Every time he sat at the piano, he spoke. Every composition a statement. Every performance a testament. Every note proof that inside the body called defective, inside the mind called inferior, inside the person treated as property, there was something real, valuable, irreducibly human. This is what we should remember about Blind Tom. Not just injustice, though that must never be forgotten. Not just cruelty, though that must be acknowledged. But also the triumph of a man who, facing everything designed to destroy him, continued to create, express, and be. Tom never got conventional revenge. He never confronted oppressors, escaped control, or received compensation. He died as he lived, at the mercy of white people who did not see him as fully human. But there is another revenge, the revenge of endurance, survival, leaving something behind enemies cannot destroy. James Bethune is dust. John Bethune is dust. Eliza Bethune is dust. Their plans, legal maneuvers, careful exploitation, all dust. But somewhere, right now, someone plays a Tom composition. Somewhere, someone hears his music for the first time and feels something stir. Somewhere, his genius touches another human across more than a century. That is Tom's revenge. Not violent, dramatic, or Hollywood satisfying, but real, lasting, true. The boy who never spoke a word said everything that mattered. He said it in music. And we are still listening. Recently, a growing movement recognizes Tom's contributions and reckons with injustice. Musicologists study his compositions. Historians uncover new documents. Performers record his works. Calls exist for halls of fame induction, museums, memorials, reparations from Bethune descendants. These efforts are valuable. They correct historical record, ensure Tom is remembered rightly. But they raise difficult questions. Can belated recognition make up for what was done? Can any memorial capture a life of captivity? Can reparation compensate for 50 years of stolen freedom? The answer is likely no. There is no undoing what was done to Tom. No giving back the life he should have had. The injustice is complete, irreversible. But perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps the point is to learn from it, to see in Tom's story a warning about treating humans as property, to recognize in his suffering the consequences of systems extracting value from black bodies while denying black humanity, to understand American music history, like America itself, is built on exploitation and theft. Tom's life was shaped by forces beyond his control. Born into slavery, sold as property, exploited as performer, kept as ward, forgotten after death. At every stage, decisions were made for him. His fate determined by laws, customs, economic interests he could not influence or escape. Yet within constraints, he found a way to be himself. To create. To leave a mark outlasting his owners. This is the paradox of Tom's life, utterly powerless, yet powerful, silenced, yet speaking, treated as nothing, yet something extraordinary, unforgettable, something we still try to understand. If Tom could speak today, what would he say? Angry at exploiters. Sad about life denied. Proud of music created. Would he care what we think over a century later? We will never know. Tom's thoughts died with him, locked inside the mind called defective. But we have his music. And in that music, if we listen carefully, we hear something like a voice, crying from darkness, demanding to be heard, insisting on its existence, value, humanity. Listen to that voice. Listen to Blind Tom. Listen to Thomas Wiggins. He has something to tell you. In the end, what Thomas Wiggins gave the world was not just music. It was proof. Proof genius knows no color. Proof the human spirit cannot be crushed by chains, laws, or cruelty. Proof that even in darkest circumstances, something beautiful can emerge. Those who exploited Tom wanted to prove the opposite: black people inferior, slavery justified, the antebellum social order natural and right. They paraded him as a freak, an anomaly, a demonstration of how far a defective Negro could go with white management. But their argument collapsed under its own contradictions. If black people were inferior, how could a blind, allegedly idiotic slave child outperform the best white musicians? If Negroes suited only for manual labor, what explained creative genius from Tom's fingers? If slavery and white supremacy just, why did they need elaborate justifications? Tom's existence refuted everything his oppressors believed. Every note argued against their worldview. Every composition evidenced their ideology was built on lies. They tried to explain him away: idiot savant, freak of nature, biological accident. They insisted his abilities did not reflect true intelligence, that he imitated sounds like a parrot, no real mind behind music. But anyone who actually listened heard the truth. The music was not mechanical, not empty imitation. It was art, expression, product of a consciousness that felt, thought, created. Tom proved them wrong simply by being. He did not need to argue, protest, or fight. He just had to play. And every time he played, lies fell away. This is Blind Tom's legacy. Not just compositions, though precious. Not just historical record of exploitation, though must be preserved. But the simple, irrefutable fact of his genius. Proof black minds are not inferior. Evidence human potential cannot be measured by skin color. That proof was paid for with a lifetime of suffering. Tom gave everything so this truth could be demonstrated. He sacrificed freedom, earnings, relationships, happiness. He endured exploitation and cruelty that would break most. In return, he got nothing but the chance to play. But that chance was enough. Through music, Tom transcended the prison surrounding him. Through art, he escaped categories meant to contain him. Through genius, he defeated ideology trying to define him as less than human. This is Blind Tom's revenge. Not violence or destruction. Not leaving oppressors bleeding. But revenge of truth, beauty, enduring proof they were wrong about everything. The boy who never spoke a single word had the last word after all. And that word was music.